Hello and welcome to another episode of the Small Agency Talk Show. I'm your host, Chip Griffin, the founder of Saga, the Small Agency Growth Alliance, and I'm very excited on this rainy Friday, at least here in New Hampshire, to have with me a good friend and a great panelist, Jody Sutter of the Sutter Company. Welcome to the show, Jody.
Thank you, Chip. It's always a pleasure to be here. I really enjoy it.
You know, I always say this is a highlight of my week because it's an opportunity to have fun conversations, illuminating conversations with other agency experts, and I know we're going to do that today. So, without further ado, let's jump right in. And if people are watching and they have questions or feedback, feel free to share your comments, and we'll try to incorporate them live. But if nothing else, I will make sure to respond to them after the show as well. So, we want to talk about tools, and your expertise in particular is business development for agencies. So, there are a lot of tools you can use, but let's explore that a little bit.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I've been thinking about is not only the tool, I know a tool set or a toolkit for business development is broad. It encompasses everything from the actual tools that you use, your CRM, those types of things, to mindset and philosophy and approach and marketing message. What I was starting to think about in my own business was that business development is kind of inexact. You do things that you know are going to yield results, and yet there's always a sense of like it's not always predictable. Consistent action is required, but it's so easy for agency owners, I think, especially if they're smaller agencies and they are doing a lot of other stuff, to abandon some of that consistency. They're like, I've been doing this for 6 months, haven't seen anything, so I knew business development wasn't for me. So I also thought, well, what if you were able to have like a point system that measured qualities across sort of the new business spectrum, and what would that look like? And would that help you as an agency understand where you're weak? And would it help me, and maybe you as a growth consultant, understand where to help them, direct them towards improvement? And then at the end of an assignment, or quarterly or annually, whatever the review period is, to look back and look at that score and revise and review. Mm-hmm. So it's been on my list of things to do for a very long time, and I just started to flesh it out this week, and I thought it might be an interesting thing to kind of stress test with you.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept because, first of all, I like that you have been clear that the tools are not just software or hardware or those kinds of things. It's a lot of other bits and pieces that go into it, and I think that's often lost sight of as folks are doing their business development. And I think part of it is because agency owners are not, for the most part, natural salespeople, right? No. That's not why they got into the business. Most of them got into it because they were, creative, or they were good at messaging, or they liked to write, or whatever. And so sales is a necessary evil. And I think part of it is you need to step back and not think of it as sales or business development. It's really relationships.
Yes.
Right. And if you start thinking about, all I'm really trying to do is build quality relationships with the right people, and that ultimately will lead to business. It's not about creating a sales process per se, where I come in and say, okay, now I got to ask for the close. And I think that's the biggest thing that agency owners make the mistake of. And so I think your system can fit into that concept.
Yeah. Although I do think it's helpful to have a process, as long as you know that process is going to change. But it's when I see agencies go right from, well, we had the first meeting, and now I need to close this. And I'm like, no. That's when it sort of is helpful to say, okay, what are those potential steps? But yes, you're absolutely right. There's so many things that go into that toolkit.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I believe in a process. I just don't like to call it a sales process, right? Because the other thing is that sales, when you start thinking about sales process, I think that a lot of agency owners naturally think, okay, I've started the process. The viable conclusion is that I've made a sale. It's really not. You're really more of a matchmaker. And so your role in that is to figure out, is this a good match with the prospect? And if not, walk away. Don't feel like you still need to get to the sale. Don't feel like you need to send a proposal just because they asked for one.
Yeah.
Find a good match.
That's right. I totally agree. Have you ever read Spin Selling or done
I
any of
have. Yes, in fact,
the
I may have it up on this bookshelf back
I
here,
think I
but
have
nobody
it
wants
there
to see
too.
the back of my head while I look to see if it's there or if it's over there.
He talks a lot about empathy and probing for the like sort of the desires at the the root desires, and he gives a really great example of, I wish I could, let's see if I can remember all of it, but it was him talking to a neighbor, and the neighbor, and maybe let's say it was the topic was Neil's car. He had an old car and he needed to replace it, and or old lawnmower or something, and maybe Neil was hesitant to replace it, and the neighbor started to ask him what they call in spin selling implication questions, not on purpose, but he kept saying like, "Well, how much time do you spend not being able to mow your lawn because it's broken, or how much time do you spend trying to repair it?" Well, I do spend a lot of time. And if you didn't have to spend all that time and you were able to mow the lawn more, blah, blah, blah. So it goes on and on and on to the point where Neil's like, "You're right, I need a new mower." And so his point of using that illustration was to say his neighbor wasn't trying to sell him anything. In fact, his neighbor was simply getting him to led him to a conclusion that was right for him. That was,
Yeah.
you know what, holding onto this old mower is actually not the best decision for me. I do need a new one. And I was like, that's what sales is. Even if it doesn't mean that they hire you, I think that's a great point on your end, is that it may not be that your agency is the one that they should work with.
Right, because I mean, they may need you. They may just not need you now, right? And
Yeah.
so if you've got a specific thing that you're selling as an agency, and you should, right? You shouldn't be
Yeah.
all things to all people as an agency.
Yeah.
You should know what you're selling and who you're selling it to. And if you have someone come to you that doesn't fit with that, don't just say, "Well, I need some revenue, so I'm going to try to figure out how to make this work." Instead, say, maybe this isn't the best fit for you today, but I'd
Yeah.
love to see you 3 months, 3 years down the road when you are ready for us.
Right. That's right. Or yeah, I'm referring to others too. When I was running business development teams at agencies, I would do that all the time when I would get prospects. In fact, I had a list of other agencies that were either smaller or larger or different specialties, so that when I had to deliver the news that we weren't the right agency for them, I said, "But you should call. Here's who you can call."
Right. Right. Yeah. And that generally builds a lot of goodwill for your agency, right? Because
Yeah.
you're not perceived as the person who's just out to get their money. You're actually trying to find the right solution. And if
Right.
you start referring business to other firms that are a better fit, maybe they'll start referring business to you. But if not,
Right.
that prospect is still going to be happier and think good of you, as opposed to they sign up with you and then 3, 6, 9 months down the road they hate you,
Yeah.
right?
And they
Which
feel resentful. They're
happens.
spending this money.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that doesn't help. So, okay, so let's go to this point system, because if
Yeah.
we agree that there's a process, and certainly I'm a big believer in measurement generally for everything that agencies do, whether it's for clients or themselves. So I'm intrigued by the point system. I guess my question would be, how do you make sure that if you come up with that kind of system that you're tracking the right stuff? Right, because
Yeah.
this also
Right.
goes to that idea that agencies just love to send out proposals and things because they just feel like they're doing something when maybe they're not really actually accomplishing anything with it.
Well, it's interesting. So far, all the things that I've started to think about measuring has nothing, shouldn't say nothing, has very little to do with sort of quantity.
Okay.
But first of all, I started out dividing it up into the three areas where I tend to see I'm needed most. So typically, when my clients come to me, they either say, "I can't find enough clients, I don't win enough," or "the whole process is way too chaotic." And so those things I think align to not finding enough clients. You can usually roll back to positioning and strategy. Um, Not closing, or I don't win enough, is about salesmanship and closing. And the chaos is about not having systems or tools.
Hmm.
So I thought those are, I think those are still sort of, I think those still kind of encompass kind of the life cycle of business development. So I started there. And so even just going to the I can't find enough clients, the strategy and positioning. So I started thinking, well, what do I want to see in an agency that I know is going to be in a position to win business? And I started thinking about things like the ability to articulate a vision,
Right.
the ability to communicate kind of a compelling origin story, the that I call this sort of like origin to impact. Like, here's what created who I am today, and here's why, because of that, I can now make an impact for you in the future. Um, the knowing who your ideal client is. And I will admit that it's kind of objective because, of course, if you give that to a client, say on zero, roll on a scale of 0 to 10, do you feel you've got a good definition of an ideal client? How do you measure that? It's not like you can say, well, is the fuel tank of your car, to go back to the car analogy, is it half full or is it full or is it empty? But it does require some interpretation. But I do also think it helps that agency owner say, well, wait a minute, is this healthy or have I been ignoring it? Or yeah, and sometimes I think people will say, yes, this is really healthy, but other things aren't.
Right. I think so much of it comes down to that ideal client, right? I think,
Yeah, I do
I
too.
don't know about you, but most of the times when I start working with an agency, they think they know who their target client, let's not say ideal client, but they think they know who their target client is. And then I start asking questions and you start to realize that there's really not much definition around it. It really comes down to whoever will pay us.
Yeah.
And so getting that right and then matching up your messaging so that you and your team, and this is particularly important for small agencies. There's no reason why every single person in your agency shouldn't be able to, in 2 to 3 sentences, say what you do and who you do it for in a way that it's crystal clear for everybody.
Right. I think that's also where knowing who, a couple of observations, stop me if I go on too long. One of the things I also kind of get a kick over is when I ask them the question, who is your ideal client? They're like, well, it's someone who is collaborative, who really is going to respect our process, who has a budget. And I'm like, oh, those are all the things that you want, but no, what do they want?
Right.
And I think that's really where the magic happens, when they can say, well, they tend to be clients whose primary audience are women, or clients who need to go from a regional to a more national brand, whatever those issues are. But yeah, agencies can be we probably have a whole conversation about this, why they're so hesitant to be willing to accept who they work with best.
Right. Well, and part of it's because I think they're afraid that they're going to limit themselves, and therefore, since they already feel like they don't have enough in their pipeline to begin with, now I'm going to make it smaller. I mean, I'm struggling to fill my pipeline, so why would I make my target smaller? But the reality is, the smaller you make it, the more likely you are to attract the right people into it, and so you'll actually see that pipeline grow, and you'll get better quality, which means they're more likely to close and turn into money.
That's the other thing I think. And again, I wish I had, maybe I should add this in the calibration tool, the time it takes to close a client. And if you can, the more you can be specific about who you're talking to, the more they'll pre-qualify themselves, the less time you will need to be searching for that needle in the haystack, and the less time you will need to close them.
Right.
I think that's the goal, is to have an outward set of messages that lets the client say, that's the right person for me. So they come in basically saying, tell me how I can work with you, rather than prove to me that you're worth having this conversation with.
Right. And I think part of it is that agencies aren't thinking enough about their ideal client beyond, I work for the pharmaceutical industry, I work for restaurants, or those kinds of things. And you really need to think about more than industry. You need to think about the specific challenge that organization has, maybe where that organization is at in its life cycle, right? There are agencies that work better with startups, some that work better with established businesses, some that work better with regulated industries or private companies. It's all sorts of different things. And so you really need to dig in and figure out, who do you really serve best? And think about and it may even be about the individuals, right? Because we always think about, well, this agency works for that client. No, the people at that agency work for the people at that client. And so it may be that I work better with a first-time young CMO, or maybe I work better with one who's been around forever and knows how everything's done and worked with a million agencies. You got to figure out what works for you.
Yeah, you bring up a really interesting point, and boy, are we already going down like a rabbit hole? But that's okay. But that's
it's the beauty of this show. We don't have a specific roadmap, and so we can follow that string wherever it goes.
But this idea of also understanding where the individual is, and their, not only in the business's life cycle, but their own life cycle. So one of the tools I also reference a lot in my work is called the Bain, as in Bain and Company, Bain B2B I'm going to forget the name of the tool, but it's a B2B hierarchy. And it essentially what it says is that for a consumer, a B2C hierarchy, it says that, you meet your basic needs first. And then, first it's like food on the table. And then up at the top of the pyramid is the Porsche. But, or is that the sense of fulfillment, maybe Porsche sort of in the middle. And up at the top is that sense of fulfillment, personal fulfillment. And Bain and Company says it's exactly the same thing for B2B. And I agree that even though that the reason we are more likely to buy from one versus the other is often, you can often roll that back to, they're going to help me get farther in my career. And I was working with a brand strategy firm, and the owner's like, oh yeah, totally. We know that we have helped our clients get promotions or grow within their agency or get recognition. And he said that's a huge part of our sales process or our sales approach. I'm trying to stay away from this process thing. And so, yeah, I think that's really interesting. And the other thing that's interesting about that is that if you're talking about new CMOs, then I think to your point, you break beyond the industry sector. So I think that's also, I try to mix and match in different ways too, to show that to agencies that it can actually be quite liberating and not limiting. So going back to the new CMO, there are lots of new CMOs in a lot of sectors. So it actually doesn't limit you.
Yeah, and I think part of this comes from there are so many of our fellow experts who like to use the term niching down, right? And I think that just the way that phrase sounds, it sounds limiting. And so I always prefer just to say find your focus, right? Because it's not it's not so much. First of all, down has that connotation that you're just, I don't know. I don't like the directionality of it. So
yeah, great point.
Yeah, so I think if you think about it that way, it actually opens up opportunities for you rather than closing them off.
Yeah. And it can, it's also much easier than to think about what they need rather than what you need. So,
Right.
these new CMOs need, I don't know, I'm just going to make it up on the top. Like what they need is so much more different than a seasoned CMO in a legacy business. And
Right.
so then it becomes less about like, well, we want a collaborator and we want a marketer who's going to pay us well. And it becomes like, no, more that, that new CMO needs boots on the ground, that needs an agency that can go in and sort of be its internal marketing department or whatever it is. And that's the stuff that I think a client really reacts to.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem is that agencies don't think strategically about this business development. And so when a prospect comes to them and they say, I need a website, or I need some SEO, or I need an ad campaign, we go into order taker mode and we say, okay, well, here's how I would do that. Instead of saying, hold on, let's talk about what you're actually experiencing and what you're trying to achieve. It would be sort of like going into the doctor's office when you go and you say, I need some antibiotics. The doctor says, hold on, before I prescribe those to you, let me ask, what are your symptoms? What's wrong with you?
You were going back. I have another theory about why this happens. You first started talking about how they're just not trained business development people. Do you think that's the crux, the reason why they don't? It's not even so much challenging, but they don't probe for more information.
I think it's fear. I think it's fear.
Fear and people pleasing too. It's like the whole agency business is all services business. The client's always right, and they said they want it, so they must want it.
Yeah, I think the people pleasing comes in more once they are a client. I think in the business development process, it's that fear that you're not going to get the business, or that you're not going to generate enough revenue in the next month. There's people are in the agency world are often talking about feast or famine, particularly smaller agencies, and the revenue roller coaster. And I always need to be looking for where that next buck is going to come from, and that's a very dangerous way to approach your agency's growth, because then you're not deciding where the agency's going.
Yeah.
Your phone is telling you where you're going. Yeah. And that's just, and you certainly have to listen to the market. I mean, if you're going out there and you've got an idea for your ideal client and what you provide them and it's not working, by all means, come up with a different plan. Don't just keep banging your head against the wall and expect a different outcome. But don't just allow the winds to take you because someone called you up and says, this is what I need. Because you may get the business in the short term, but they're going back to the example earlier, they're going to dislike you 6 or 9 months down the road once they realize it was the wrong solution for them.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of times I was just talking, I had a really difficult conversation with an agency client of mine who it's exactly what I've been trying to get them to do um, to challenge, to help the client shape the strategy, to be that expert, not the order taker. And they were talking to a very large university who they'd actually done a lot of work for, their digital agency. And then the university kind of wanted to take that project and grow it and replicate it over a number of different schools and departments. But because they're a public university, they put it back out to open bid. But prior to doing that, essentially my client put together a whole plan for them. And then they went through the process and they didn't get chosen. And that really hurt. And so, of course, I'm trying to say as a business developer, like you got to let go of all the sort of the personal disappointment and that feeling of betrayal. And first of all, because they can't go back. Again, if I had a chance to help them through that earlier, I would have said, don't give them the freaking plan.
Right.
Figure
Right.
out some other way. Yeah, so, but even though they lost this, like there's still a future opportunity there. Not only that, but they got a long email from the CMO that, first of all, you could tell that the CMO felt really guilty about it, and probably the CMO, it was out of that person's hands essentially. But it also said, I really want to work with you on some other things. So it's up to my client whether they feel like they have or haven't been so personally betrayed that it's going to ruin the relationship. But I said, look, like go back in there, build that relationship up again, but also don't be afraid to be the expert to say, like, here's what you need, here's why your approach is going to fail. Because the big concern is someone else probably came in at a much lower price to do a massive project, and 6 to 9 months, the university may realize that they made a grave mistake. And as a business developer, that's when I say, that's when I'm going to go back there. As the agency partner, that's where he says, like, I feel so hurt, I don't even want to approach it. Like, okay. But right. I do think, yeah, it's that return to I call them the rejectors, but you never want to lose the rejectors in your network because they already know you. They probably didn't reject you because you're an awful person or you do bad work, but for reasons beyond your control. And you should nurture them as much as the clients who keep hiring you.
Yeah, and I love that you've called out the problem of the agencies being frustrated when they provide an entire plan to a prospect and they get told no. And it's so frustrating for me to watch this take place because so often the client hasn't even asked for that level of detail. Yeah. So often you're so excited about the idea that you say, look, here's how and if I only give you enough information, you will pick me. And I think there's this perception that prospects are often asking for these things. And while that does happen, certainly, there are some cases where prospects ask for too much in terms of ideas or plan. More often than not, it's self-inflicted. More often than not, it's the agency putting all of this time and effort in because they think they can wow the prospect and that's how they're going to win the business. The problem is, and I've been part of agency pitch teams in larger agencies where we've done this, we put these plans together based on a 20-minute conversation with the prospect. We have no data. We don't really have much information. We haven't been able to ask any questions. So what makes us think that we can put together this whole campaign plan based on 20 minutes of conversation?
Right. Or you also realize, I think in this case too, the deliverable is going to be quite complex. And so an agency will look at that and they'll say, well, we have to figure out everything. We've got to figure out how many developers we need and what they're going to do and how much they're going to, and that's also so time consuming, and it may not really be what the client is asking for or needs at the moment.
Right, and that's why agencies that do complex projects need to have paid discovery as their first step.
Yeah, I agree.
And they really need to say, okay, look, we're not going to bid this whole project for you yet because we need to sit down and figure out what the plan is. And we're happy to give you the plan and you can then hire us to implement it or hire someone else, but you've got to work with us on the actual plan. I'm
going to play a little bit of devil's advocate. So if I were my client, he would say to me, but that's unrealistic because this is procurement who is running this. And if we went in and said, you got to pay us for discovery, we wouldn't have gotten it. And if we go in with a big plan, well, we might get it. Like there's sort of at least we're in the mix. What do you say?
So my view is that most small agencies shouldn't be dealing with prospects who have procurement. Most small agencies are better off, working with mid-sized businesses that are not yet at that stage, because procurement is a game that really requires a lot of excess resources on your side to deal with on an ongoing basis. Not just, because most people who haven't dealt with procurement before think that procurement ends once you get to contract. It doesn't. They stick their nose under the tent all throughout the relationship. And it's miserable. It's absolutely horrible. And so my view is, if you are a small agency, if you've got 25 or fewer employees, just stay away from procurement. It's not worth the hassle.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I wonder if they're going to be listening to this. They do a lot of work for higher ed, and that's a tricky one, because even small institutions have some kind of procurement-led process. But I also, I think that's also going back to how we started talking about this, which is nothing to do with calibration, but the relationship part. That's where the strength of the relationship with the person who potentially inside the organization that can affect and have a conversation with the procurement to tell them, like, look, this is why this approach isn't going to work. This is why what my agency partner is telling me is why I believe is right. That's when we have a little more leverage.
Right. Well, and that's a good point too, because, and it's why Ginny Dietrich and I end our podcast every week with "It depends," because there are
My
certain
answer.
right. I mean, we're consultants, right? So it depends. Who knows? We'll offer you an opinion. It depends.
Well, it really does. But there's so many. Every situation, there's so many different variables.
And there are some industries where what I would call my rules can't be followed. Right. There are certain industries where you have to deal with procurement. There are certain industries where you can't just hit delete when you see an RFP, which is my general advice. In most industries, if you see an RFP and just delete it. It's not worth it. If you haven't had a conversation before that RFP showed up, delete it. Move on. You'll have a much better, more enjoyable week if you do. But there are some places, higher ed, government, travel and tourism. There are a few of these where RFPs and or procurement are a necessary evil. Now, if you're going to do that, I think the key is you need to have the relationship with your client within the organization, but you also need to work to build a relationship with procurement. And you can't view procurement just as the enemy. You have to view them as someone that you need to find a way to work with. It's sort of, procurement's like your mother-in-law, right?
Yeah.
You can't just ignore her and assume that she's going to go away. She's going to be there, and so you've got to build that relationship to at least a passable level.
And you have to, so then that goes back to
with apologies to my mother-in-law, of course, but she doesn't watch this, I'm sure. So.
But it goes back to, you need to know who your client is so you can build a prospect list so that you can then create a nurture campaign so that you're both talking to the CMO as well as doing outreach to the procurement department. Here's who we are. Here's why we make a difference. Here's why we make it easier for procurement, so that the procurement department also know who you are by the time they send out the RFP.
Right. And you can actually learn stuff from procurement if you build a relationship. They will actually tell you things. And sometimes when I've had conversations with procurement officers, they will share information that they've gotten from my client at the business that I didn't know already.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so that can be, if you build a good relationship, they will sometimes say, well, the client's been complaining about this to me. Oh, okay. Well, now I know that, because, in the agency world, we're often non-confrontational, but so are our clients. And so if you can find that intermediary who will pass on, oh, they're frustrated about this. Okay, now I can address it before it becomes a major issue.
Gosh, that's so interesting. A friend of mine, he was a procurement officer. He's done procurement relations on the agency side, but he's also worked for big marketers. And he'll talk about how he's a trained negotiator, and most procurement professionals are, and most agency owners aren't. Right. And he's like, look, I'll just ask. I'm always, as a procurement person, I'm always going to ask you to lower your price. And if you're willing to do it, more power to me. And so his point being is like, push back. Of course, that procurement is going to represent their business as best as possible. Their job is to lower the price, get more for less. And I think that's also where, you can't be people pleaser. You got to understand, why is that lower cost important? What's it going to get? What are you willing to sacrifice?
And the sacrifice piece is absolutely critical there because
Yeah.
so often agencies just reduce the price because they got
Yes.
pushback, and they don't change scope, they don't change financial. You have to get something in return. You cannot have a negotiation where you just cave in. You've got to say, okay, I can give you this lower price, but you have to pay me in 30 instead of 90, or you have to give up this particular thing, or it takes longer for us to produce this report, or what something. You need to get something, if for no other reason than to set the marker in place that you're not going to be bullied.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So
sometimes I even say with negotiations, like to tell them, like, well, if you pay us less, we then we run up against this predicament about whatever it might be, paying our team or paying our rent, and how we're like, and so bring them into the problem. Like, that's a problem we need to solve together. And anyway, now we're talking about procurement and negotiation.
I know we have covered a lot of ground here. I would give us lots of points for covering a lot of ground. Not so many points for actually talking about the point system, though. So, Jody, you're going to have to come back so we can explore that one further, because we are out of time. We have hit the limit here, and the broadcasters will. No, there's no broadcast, right? We could go on forever, but we're not going to, because nobody wants.
Commercial.
Yes, we got to cut. We got to cut to commercial. If someone would like to learn more about you, or they'd like to continue this conversation with you, Jody, where can they find you?
Yeah, they can find me on my website, which is thesuttercompany.com, and that's Sutter, S like Sam, and with 2 T's, Sutter like the wine. They can also email me, Jody, Jody, at thesuttercompany.com.
Excellent. And of course, if you are interested in seeing replays of this or any other episode, you can go to smallagency.tv, and I'm sure you'll see more of Jody here in the future, because I don't think I've irritated you enough to say no on the next invitation.
Well, hopefully likewise. I always enjoy this half hour on a Friday. Love it.
It is fun. So have a good weekend, Jody. Everybody have a great week next week, and I look forward to seeing all of you back here next Friday.